Now, this lesson is really on how to use databases to teach various different concepts. So I'm going to choose a concept here from, well, you can consider it science, nutrition, health, whatever. It's a condition known as osteoporosis. Okay, so osteoporosis is a condition which oftentimes leads to a degeneration of the spine. You can see here that we're looking at a healthy younger spine and a curved older spine. And oftentimes you'll see elderly people in particular with kind of a hunched back. And that oftentimes is due to a degeneration of the bone itself, known as osteoporosis. In terms of the term osteoporosis, os, of course, means bone, and porous, meaning holy, and so that this is a bone that has a very low density. You can do an analysis of bone density by doing what's called a bone density scan, and simply it's X-ray in very low dosages, and it scans back and forth across your skeleton, and you'll notice that if you have any deficiencies. I actually had this test done and found that wow, I was low in calcium and low in bone density, and so I do run the risk of having osteoporosis and so forth. So if you have low bone density, it could be a precursor to something like osteoporosis. Now there's ways to deal with this. There's ways both in terms of exercise, which is one way that I'm actually dealing with this. I like exercise anyway, and basically when you exercise, it causes your muscles to retain calcium and become stronger. So I ride my bike to the top of the mountain a few times a week, not primarily for purposes of preventing osteoporosis, but it has that added benefit and so forth as well. But if we're looking at the database here, there's no entry here for the amount of exercise. You're really looking at the dietary issues you might be able to control to basically maybe deter the onset of osteoporosis. If we were to look at a bone diagram here, you can see a normal bone. If you were to look in kind of a longitudinal section through this, you can see how all of the portion here of the marrow and so forth has a lot more dense structure than an osteoporotic bone, like you'll see over here. So the question is, how do you prevent it from going from this stage here to this stage here? Well, we do know that bone has a lot of calcium in it, and we need calcium in our diets, and calcium is needed here for the maintenance of bone and for teeth. It's also needed for blood clotting and normal heart rate and so forth. So calcium is important for many, many different things. But we're interested primarily here for bone structure, teeth structure, and so forth to prevent osteoporosis. So if we don't pay attention to this, we might end up with bone injuries and so forth. Like you can see a hip fracture here, which is very common in elderly people. Oftentimes people fall and say, the fall broke their hip, when in reality it may have been that their hip broke, causing them to fall. And so particularly common in a lot of elderly people is a hip fracture. You can have a lot of weight, and you can look at the vector coming down like this, and then you're asked to transduce that weight across into the femur here, and right at this junction here between the head of the femur and the long portion of the bone can oftentimes snap. So, well, what do we need to do to try to prevent that? We do know that you need to have a lot of calcium, as we talked about. Okay, so calcium is the primary mineral. Bones are made of, at least the inorganic component of bones is primarily made out of calcium phosphate, so calcium tends to be the most limiting component for bone structure. Well, we can get calcium from our diet. You can see right here that These are things which are high in calcium. And it makes sense when you think about this that leafy vegetables are high in calcium because calcium is a mineral. So it's going to be found in the soil. The plants absorb this through their xylem. They incorporate it into their cells. And then when organisms eat those leafy vegetables, that they absorb the calcium into their own diet. And so it's not surprising that milk or cheese are high in calcium. Because you think about that, cows eat a lot of grass, eat a lot of green leafy things, and they concentrate the calcium, and of course that comes out in the form of milk and other milk products such as cheese. So we might want to look for foods which are high in calcium content. And but we need more than just calcium. We need a way of actually causing that calcium to be fixed into the bone. And vitamin D is known to be instrumental in this. Now, vitamin D is actually synthesized in the skin by exposure to light, and so vitamin D deficiencies tend to be much more of a problem in areas where they don't get so much sunlight. So, for example, extreme northern latitudes like Scandinavia and so forth would tend to have a lot more problems with vitamin D if they didn't supplement their diet with sufficient vitamin D. Obviously, in Scandinavian countries, they probably have a lot of fish, which may prevent the onset of osteoporosis by providing sufficient vitamin D that way. So let's say we were going to do a dietary analysis, and we want to look at those foods which are high in vitamin D, which is that vitamin which is necessary for the deposition of the calcium that we have in the diet being placed into the bones to be able to get that nice healthy bone structure, so that we can have bones which look like this rather than bones which look like this. So looking at the database, we're going to look at two things right now, and we could look at more, but we're going to keep it fairly simple for right now. We're going to just look at calcium concentration, and we're also going to look at vitamin D concentration. And again, this is all based on serving sizes, which are defined generally by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And you'll see these on packages and so forth in terms of what the FDA recommended serving size is. Well, when we look at this database here, we can see again there's many different fields, and it gets kind of confusing when you have so many here. What we want to do is we're going to hide those fields which are not essential for our particular discussion right here. So we're going to hide here things like actually weight, percent water, energy, protein. Actually, we're going to keep protein out because protein also is helpful in terms of reducing osteoporosis in a different way it interacts, but we're going to keep that one available. And I'm going to say that I'd like to right now, if I right click here and say I would like to hide those. Now those are hidden. You'll notice it goes A, B, C, and then jumps to G. If I was to right click on G, I could say unhide, and anything which was there is going to be unhid. So let's say I click on C and G, right click, and I say unhide, and now you can see all of those rows that were hidden. So the data isn't destroyed. The data is simply hidden from view so that you can juxtapose the fields you're really interested in. So in this case right here, I'm going to highlight columns D, E, and F. Right click in this row header here, actually above the field names, right where it says D, E, and F. And if I right click there, I can hide those. Then I'm going to go over and I'm going to choose the same things over here. I'm going to hide the next ones. Again, clicking in this gray zone where the actual letters appear, we'll say that we're going to hide those as well. And we're going to continue to hide them all the way down until we find vitamin D. So again, clicking the top and saying hide. And we can see as we go farther down here, we're almost to that point. Well, unfortunately, I just realized that this database doesn't have vitamin D in it, so we'll just look here in terms of the calcium concentrations. You know how to kind of remove the various different things. We'll look at calcium concentrations and protein. If we had vitamin D in this database, we would sort on that as well. But now we want to look for those things which are high in calcium. So I click over here on calcium and I'd say I'd like to look at descending, which will put the highest values at the top. And now we can see here that vanilla ice cream has the highest calcium concentration per serving size. As you're going to scroll down here, you're going to see that the numbers will drop. And so it's organized in sequential order from high to low. Now, if you were trying to determine the foods that would be best for recommending to a person who might have the risk of osteoporosis, you definitely want to include those foods that are high in calcium. You'd also want to include those foods that are high in vitamin D. And dietitians have also found that high protein diets tend to also somehow reduce the risk of osteoporosis. So since we don't have the vitamin D category in this particular database, we're going to just look at the calcium and the protein. So we're going to look at this and kind of arbitrarily decide which values we think would be sufficient to recommend to be in one's diet to reduce the risk of osteoporosis. So arbitrarily we'll say that anything in the top 25% of our database might be something to consider. Well, we can see how many there are in the database by just seeing the page down or scrolling down. And we can see in this particular database there appear to be 180 records. The first one is simply the category headers, so subtracting 1 from 181 gives us 180. So we're going to say anything in the top 45 foods should be something to be considered in terms of our particular search. So remember, we're trying to reduce the risk of osteoporosis. We're going to look over here at element number 45. So the record for 45 is Brussels sprouts, and we can look in terms of the calcium concentrations of Brussels sprouts is 56 milligrams per serving size. Again, the units appear right up here, so 56 milligrams of calcium per serving size of Brussels sprouts. So we're going to say anything which is higher than that is a food that we should consider. So we're going to click on our search here, and we're going to choose anything which is greater than or equal to 56. And now we have just those foods which are greater than or equal to 56. We'll do the same thing over here in proteins. So of the remaining foods and proteins, the remaining foods in the database, we'll look at proteins here, and we're going to sort those by descending value as well. So we can see here that cottage cheese has the highest, but now we started off with 45, so now we're going to go just to our 15th record here, which again, looking down here, would actually be element number 16, is going to be kefir. And so we're going to say, okay, we want those things which are also have protein concentration greater than or equal to 9.3, which is a value for our 15th entry here. So we're going to look at this, and we're going to say that we would also like to have ones that are greater than or equal to 9.3 milligrams of protein. So the foods that we see over here, starting with cottage cheese and going down to kefir, are all foods which are high in calcium, and then also, given that fact, they also happen to be high in protein. Now, knowing that proteins can help prevent osteoporosis, then the foods which are going to be high in calcium and protein would be doubly good in terms of reducing the risk of osteoporosis. Again, we should also look at vitamin D, which unfortunately is not in this database. But you can see here how to sort the information, how to do the record selections to be able to get to the foods that you're interested in. Now, when you look at the numbers here on the left, you'll see that they're all blue. That simply indicates that you're not looking at the full database. You know, so it goes from 1 to 16 and then jumps to 1 to 182. That means we've selected here just these 15 entries here, and out of the large set of data. And we've gotten to foods that are interesting to us, in other words, foods that we think might help reduce the risk of osteoporosis. Well, the question is, how do we get all that information back, and how do we get all of the categories that are hidden now back? Well, if we were to click on those categories that we searched for, selected for initially, and the original filters, we can turn those filters off. So we can say, just go back to choose one right here, and or alternatively, you can go back on the protein category there and just say, again, just that you would like to clear the filter, and that basically restores your database. To unhide the fields, you would click up across all those ones which are blue, right click here, and just say, okay, what we'd like to do right now is we'd like to unhide. So now we can see here's all of our entries and so forth. We have all of our data back, and we can start to do another analysis.